March 5th, 1811. The Spanish coast near Cadiz. Lieutenant General Thomas Graham watched in disbelief as his Spanish allies, 10,000 men commanded by General Manuel La Peña, refused his order to turn and face the French army approaching from the rear. The Spanish general had argued all morning. Now, with French forces closing in, La Peña simply marched his troops away from the battlefield. He was leaving 4,000 British soldiers to face 9,000 French veterans alone. Graham was 62 years old, a Scottish general who joined the army late in life after personal tragedy. He'd spent years fighting alongside Spanish forces in the Peninsular War. He trusted them, respected them, and now they were abandoning him to certain destruction. The French had superior numbers, better position, and were already deploying for attack. Every tactical consideration said Graham should retreat immediately, save his outnumbered force, live to fight another day. But Graham looked at his regiments, British infantry, who'd marched across Spain, fought in brutal conditions, and trusted their commanders to lead them properly. And he made a decision that would define his career and demonstrate what British troops could achieve when abandoned by supposed allies. He would attack 4,000 against 9,000, uphill, with the Spanish watching from a safe distance. This is the story of the Battle of Barossa, the day British forces fought alone against superior numbers because their allies refused to engage. The victory won through discipline and courage when cooperation failed, and the battle that proved British infantry didn't need help to defeat the French, just the chance to close with the enemy. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're covering the battle where British forces won despite being betrayed by their allies. The engagement that showed what happens when professional soldiers fight without the support they were promised. But before we get to that moment of betrayal, before we watch British regiments charge uphill against overwhelming odds, we need to understand how Britain ended up fighting in Spain and why Spanish cooperation mattered so much. And if you're enjoying this, subscribe. We cover the battles where British forces demonstrated professional excellence, the victories won through discipline and determination, even when circumstances were terrible. The Peninsular War had been raging since 1808. Napoleon had placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, triggering a massive popular uprising. Spain's regular armies had been defeated repeatedly, but guerrilla warfare and popular resistance prevented French consolidation of control. Britain saw opportunity. By supporting Spanish and Portuguese resistance, Britain could open a second front against Napoleon, drain French resources, and protect British interests in Portugal. By 1811, British forces under Wellington controlled much of Portugal and were conducting operations in Spain. The strategy required cooperation with Spanish armies. On paper, Spain had large military forces. In practice, Spanish armies were poorly organised, inadequately supplied, and commanded by officers whose military competence varied wildly. Wellington had learned to work around Spanish limitations, but British officers serving in combined operations often found Spanish commanders frustrating. Cadiz, Spain's major Atlantic port, had been under French siege since 1810. The city held enormous strategic importance. If Cadiz fell, French forces would control Spain's Atlantic coast and potentially threaten British naval operations. Spanish and British forces defended the city, supplied by British ships. The siege had settled into stalemate. The French lacked strength to storm the fortifications, but Spanish forces couldn't break the siege. In early 1811, Spanish commanders planned an ambitious operation to relieve Cadiz and defeat the besieging French army. General La Peña would lead a Spanish force of 10,000 troops on an amphibious landing south of French positions. British forces under Thomas Graham, approximately 4,000 troops, would accompany the operation. The combined army would march north and attack French siege lines from the rear, while Cadiz's garrison attacked from the front. The French, caught between two forces, would be destroyed or forced to retreat. Thomas Graham was an unusual British general. Born into Scottish landed gentry, he'd lived as a country gentleman until his 40s. When his wife died in 1792, French revolutionary mobs desecrated her funeral cortege in southern France. This personal tragedy drove Graham to join the army at age 43. He raised a regiment at his own expense and spent the next 2 decades fighting French forces wherever they appeared. By 1811, he was an experienced commander who'd proven his abilities in multiple campaigns. Graham understood that the Barossa operation depended on cooperation between British and Spanish forces. He'd planned carefully with La Peña. The combined army would move swiftly, maintain surprise, and hit French positions with overwhelming force. Success required both commanders to coordinate movements and commit their forces decisively when the moment came. The operation began well. On February 21st, Spanish and British forces landed at Tarifa, south of French positions. The combined army numbered about 14,000 men, La Peña's 10,000 Spanish troops, plus Graham's 4,000 British. They began marching north along the coast toward French siege lines. For the first few days, the advance proceeded smoothly. French forces hadn't detected the movement. Surprise was maintained. But as the army approached French positions, problems emerged. La Peña proved indecisive. He changed plans repeatedly. He delayed when speed mattered. Graham, commanding British forces as part of the combined army, could only advise La Peña held overall command. The Spanish general's hesitation gave French commanders time to respond. Marshal Victor, commanding French siege forces around Cadiz, received intelligence about the Spanish-British army moving toward his rear. He reacted quickly and competently. Victor couldn't abandon the siege entirely. That would allow Cadiz's garrison to attack his rear, but he could detach a strong force to intercept the approaching threat. He sent approximately 9,000 troops under General Ruffin to block the Spanish-British advance. On the morning of March 5th, the situation became critical. La Peña's army was marching along the coast near a ridge called the Cerro del Puerco, the Pig's Hill. Graham's British forces were in the rear of the column. French forces under Ruffin appeared on the ridge above, occupying the high ground and deploying for battle. The French had superior position and roughly equal numbers to the entire Spanish-British force. Graham immediately recognised the danger. French forces on the heights could attack the column's flank or rear. The only solution was to turn and drive the French off the ridge before they completed their deployment. Graham rode to La Peña and urged immediate action. Turn the army, deploy for battle, attack the French before they solidified their position. La Peña refused. He argued that the mission was to reach Cadiz, not fight battles. He insisted on continuing the march. When Graham pressed the point, explaining that French forces on the ridge threatened the entire operation, La Peña grew angry. The argument consumed precious time, while French forces improved their positions. Finally, Graham proposed a compromise. His British forces would turn and engage the French on the ridge. This would protect the Spanish column's flank and rear. La Peña's larger Spanish force could continue marching toward Cadiz, complete the original mission, and possibly attack French siege lines while Ruffin's detachment was occupied. La Peña agreed, perhaps because this plan allowed him to avoid battle entirely. Graham rode back to his British regiments and gave the orders. 4,000 British troops would turn south, climb the ridge, and attack 9,000 French soldiers occupying strong defensive positions. The odds were terrible. The tactical situation was worse. But Graham believed British discipline and courage could overcome numerical disadvantage if his troops executed properly. The British force included several experienced regiments. The 87th Regiment, the Royal Irish Fusiliers, had fought throughout the Peninsular War. The 28th Regiment, the Gloucestershire Regiment, was one of the British Army's most distinguished units. Flank companies from the Guards regiments brought elite light infantry and grenadiers. Supporting artillery provided limited fire support. These weren't raw recruits. These were veteran soldiers who understood their profession. As British forces began deploying, the full extent of La Peña's betrayal became clear. The Spanish general didn't just decline to attack alongside British forces. He marched his entire 10,000-man army away from the battlefield. He was abandoning Graham completely. Spanish troops would take no part in the battle. British soldiers would fight alone against superior numbers with no support whatsoever. Graham's officers were furious. Some urged withdrawal. The mission was compromised. Spanish cooperation had collapsed. 4,000 men couldn't reasonably be expected to defeat 9,000 in strong positions. Retreating was the sensible option, but Graham refused. His troops were deployed, the French were right there, and British soldiers didn't abandon a fight just because the odds were poor or allies proved unreliable. The British attack began in mid-morning. Regiments advanced up the slopes of Cerro del Puerco, in line formation, moving steadily toward French positions. French artillery opened fire immediately. Round shot crashed through British ranks. Men fell. Gaps appeared in the lines, but British soldiers closed ranks automatically and kept advancing. This was what endless drill accomplished: mechanical response to casualties that maintained formation under fire. French infantry waited in strong positions along the ridge. They'd had time to deploy properly and choose their ground. As British lines came into effective musket range, French battalions delivered organised volleys. The firefight Graham had anticipated began. Both sides stood and exchanged fire at brutal range. The horrific reality of Napoleonic combat, where disciplined troops shot at each other until one side broke. British fire discipline proved superior. Years of training and combat experience showed in the steady, controlled volleys British regiments delivered. French troops fought well. These were veterans of multiple campaigns, but British professional standards made the difference. Reload, fire, reload, fire. The mechanical precision of British musketry ground down French resistance. The 87th Regiment, advancing on the British right, encountered particularly strong French resistance. A French regiment had deployed behind a stone wall with clear fields of fire. The position was nearly impregnable to frontal assault, but the 87th's commander spotted a weakness. French positions didn't extend far enough along the ridge. There was space to flank the position. The 87th shifted direction under fire, extended their advance to the right, and began working around the French flank. It was dangerous. The manoeuvre exposed them to enfilading fire, but disciplined execution made it possible. As the 87th threatened the French regiment's flank, French defenders had to choose: maintain position and be surrounded, or abandon the stone wall. The French chose to withdraw. But they'd waited too long. As they pulled back, the 87th charged. British infantry crashed into the withdrawing French battalion. Bayonets and close combat replaced musket volleys. In the chaos of melee, the 87th captured a French eagle, the battalion standard that represented the regiment's honour. Taking an eagle was one of the highest achievements in Napoleonic warfare. French regiments defended their eagles to the death. Capturing one required extraordinary courage and fighting ability. While the 87th achieved their triumph on the right, British forces across the entire line were pressing forward. French battalions that had seemed secure in their positions found themselves under relentless pressure from British infantry who advanced despite casualties, maintained formation despite losses, and simply refused to break. Marshal Victor, watching the battle develop, attempted to reinforce Ruffin's division. Additional French troops moved toward the ridge to help stem the British attack. But the reinforcements arrived piecemeal and couldn't coordinate with forces already engaged. British regiments, having seized momentum, kept attacking before French forces could organise effective defence. By early afternoon, French positions on the ridge were collapsing. What had started as a defensive position, with superior numbers and good ground, had become a desperate fighting retreat. British forces, despite being outnumbered more than 2-1, had broken French resistance through superior discipline and aggressive execution. French casualties were severe. Approximately 2,000 French soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The French army that had confidently occupied the ridge that morning was retreating in disorder by afternoon. Several French battalions had been shattered. The Eagle, captured by the 87th, was being carried triumphantly to British headquarters. British casualties were significant, but manageable. Approximately 1,500 killed and wounded from a force of 4,000. Heavy losses that demonstrated the intensity of combat. But crucially, British forces retained cohesion. Regiments that had taken casualties were still organised and capable. Officers maintained command. The army remained a functioning military force, despite losses. Meanwhile, General La Peña and his 10,000 Spanish troops had watched the entire battle from a safe distance without firing a shot. When Graham's outnumbered British forces began winning, La Peña didn't order his troops to exploit the victory. He didn't pursue retreating French forces. He didn't attempt to complete the original mission of attacking French siege lines. He simply continued marching toward Cadiz with his intact army, as if nothing had happened. The strategic consequences of Barossa were mixed. The battle itself was a clear British victory. French forces had been defeated and driven from strong positions. The captured eagle was tangible proof of British success. French casualties were heavy, and French morale was damaged. For a moment, the siege of Cadiz seemed vulnerable, but La Peña's refusal to capitalise on Graham's victory meant the broader operation failed. French siege lines around Cadiz weren't broken. Victor's main force remained intact. The siege continued. The ambitious plan to relieve Cadiz completely had collapsed due to Spanish command failures rather than French strength. Graham's fury at La Peña was barely controlled. In reports to Wellington and British commanders, Graham made his opinion of Spanish military leadership brutally clear. He'd been betrayed by an ally who refused to fight, despite having overwhelming numerical superiority when combined British-Spanish forces were considered. British troops had won despite this betrayal, but the victory could have been so much more if Spanish forces had simply done their duty. For Wellington, Barossa confirmed what he'd learned through years of working with Spanish armies. Spanish soldiers often fought bravely. Spanish guerrillas were effective. But Spanish regular army commanders were frequently incompetent, politically motivated, and unwilling to cooperate with British forces effectively. Wellington's future planning would account for this reality. British forces would operate more independently. Cooperation with Spanish armies would be assumed unreliable until proven otherwise. For British pride, Barossa represented something important. It demonstrated that when British professional soldiers were properly led and committed to battle, they could defeat numerically superior French forces without help. The popular narrative of peninsular war cooperation, British and Spanish forces working together against France, was complicated by the reality that British forces sometimes had to win alone when allies failed them. The 87th Regiment's capture of the French Eagle became famous throughout Britain. Eagles were incredibly rare trophies. Few British units had captured one. The 87th's achievement was celebrated in Parliament, commemorated in regimental traditions, and recognised as extraordinary military accomplishment. The Eagle itself was presented to the Prince Regent and became a treasured symbol of British military excellence. The battle also highlighted General Graham's leadership qualities. He'd made the difficult decision to fight despite being abandoned by allies. He deployed his forces effectively, he'd inspired them to attack against superior numbers, and he'd achieved victory through professional skill rather than numerical advantage. Wellington recognised Graham's abilities and employed him in increasingly important roles throughout the remainder of the war. For the soldiers who fought at Barossa, the battle demonstrated something fundamental about military professionalism. When command is competent, when discipline is maintained, when courage is combined with skill, British infantry could defeat any opponent regardless of odds or circumstances. They didn't need allies to hold their hands. They didn't require numerical superiority. They just needed good officers, proper training, and the opportunity to close with the enemy. The battle also revealed the importance of combined operations cooperation. La Peña's failure wasn't just his personal incompetence. It was a systemic problem with multinational coalitions. Different armies had different training, different tactical doctrines, different command cultures. Making them work together required more than just shared strategic goals. It required commanders who understood their allies' capabilities, respected their professional judgment, and committed to cooperative action, even when personally uncomfortable. Graham had assumed La Peña would fight because the tactical situation demanded it. But La Peña's conception of command didn't include accepting tactical advice from subordinate Allied commanders. His political considerations outweighed military necessity. He'd rather abandon British forces than risk his Spanish army in battle. This wasn't cowardice exactly. It was a fundamentally different understanding of what command responsibilities entailed. For British military culture, Barossa reinforced existing beliefs about professional excellence and self-reliance. British forces had proven they could win without Allied support. They demonstrated superior discipline and tactical execution. They'd captured an enemy standard through courage and skill. These were exactly the kinds of achievements that British military tradition celebrated. Victories won through professional competence against unfavourable odds. The captured eagle became more than just a trophy. It symbolised British independence from unreliable allies. It represented the value of professional training over numerical strength. It demonstrated that courage combined with discipline could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. For a nation fighting a long war against Napoleon, with allies whose commitment and competence varied wildly, these were reassuring messages. Wellington's subsequent Peninsular campaigns would vindicate the lessons of Barossa. British forces achieved their greatest successes when operating independently or with Portuguese troops Wellington had personally trained and organised. Spanish cooperation remained important for strategic reasons: guerrilla warfare, territorial control, popular resistance. But British tactical success depended on British forces executing British plans. If this is the kind of the military history that interests you, battles won despite being abandoned by allies, victories achieved through professional skill against superior numbers, moments when British forces proved they could win alone when cooperation failed, then you know what to do. These are the stories that demonstrate British military excellence at its finest. These are the examples of courage and professionalism that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching Britain's history, the battles where British forces demonstrated that superior training and discipline matter more than numerical advantage or Allied support told the way they deserve to be told.